Microphone check. Microphone. Microphone check. You ready, gentlemen? Good evening, everyone. If I could ask to take your seats or find a place to stand, and we're going to start here in about 20 seconds. Thank you. All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Dakota Territory Air Museum's 75th anniversary commemoration of D-Day landings in Normandy. Operation Overlord, which is the technical name for the operation, was the largest assembly of military might ever seen in the history of mankind. It was the turning point of World War II in the European theater of operations, and it led directly to the destruction of Nazi Germany and the freedom of the oppressed peoples of Europe. Tonight we have several important guest speakers from the U.S. Air Force and the Consulate General of Canada. But first, I would like to introduce our honored guests, men who actually fought in World War II in campaigns ranging from New Guinea and the Philippines in the South Pacific to Utah Beach and Normandy, and the last great European battle of World War II, the Ardennes Offensive, better known to us as the Battle of the Bulge. Please give a warm welcome to Lynn Oz, John Sin, Ed Zilli, and John Benton. Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you for the service to our nation and for attending this evening's event. Thank you very much. Also, we have another special guest present this evening. Please welcome former Staff Sergeant Clinton Romeshay, a recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor in combat for actions in Afghanistan. Also present are 4 other decorated service members brought here today by the Foundation for Exceptional Warriors, who fought in campaigns ranging from the Vietnam War to Iraq and Afghanistan. Please stand up, gentlemen. At the conclusion of the ceremony, these deserving men will fly on the Duchess of Dakota, the C-53 transport plane you see here that flew in the actual D-Day operation. None of this would be possible without the support of the Air Museum and our sponsors, especially the State Bank and Trust of Kenmare. They provided the funds that got the fuel for all the aircraft, which is pretty expensive, so we thank them too. Before we introduce our evening speakers, I would like to ask those who are able to stand with me as the American Legion Post 26 Color Guard presents our nation's colors, followed by the singing of the Canadian National Anthem by our local musical talent, Melissa Spelchin, and then by Chaplain Richard Ryer. He will sing the U.S. National Anthem in the Armed Forces Medley. Colors.
Oh, Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all of us we see thee rise, the true north, strong and free. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God, keep our land glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hail at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watch were so gallantly streaming. And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does the star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land and of the free and the home of the brave?
You can talk to them about your...
You may be seated. As I share the American Forces, Armed Forces medley, if your service song is being sung, we would like for you to stand as your service flag is brought and posted to my left and to your right. And then also, after I sing the Coast Guard song, which will be the last one, if you'll join me in one rendition of God Bless America, and that's when we will stand then and sing together, God Bless America. They're almost ready over there. Over hills, over dale, we have hit the dusty trail, and the army goes marching along. In and out, hear them shout, counter march and right about, as the army is marching along. Then it's high, high, in field of fury, sound out your lumbers loud and strong, for wherever you go, you'll always know that the army is marching along. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we will fight our country's battle in the air, on land, and sea. First to fight for right and freedom, and to keep our honor proud to claim the title of the United States Marine. Anchors away, my boys, anchors away. Farewell to college joys, we sail at break of day. Go our last night on shore, drink to the foam. Until we meet once more, here's wishing you a happy voyage home. Off we go into the wild blue yonder, climbing high into the sun. Here they come, zooming to beat our thunder. Attaboy, give her the gun. Down the dive, spouting their flame on under, off on one terrible roar. We'll live in fame or go down in flame. Hey, nothing can stop the U.S. Air Force. We're always ready for the call. We place our trust in thee. Through surf and storm and howling gale, high shall our purpose be. Semper Parestis is our guide, our fame and glory too. To fight, to save, or to fight and die, a Coast Guard we are for you. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above, from the mountains to the prairies, to the ocean, where it belongs.
Thank you all for the wonderful job, and thank you for taking the time to be here today. Now, to present our first speaker from the Office of the Consulate General of Canada in Minneapolis, Consul and Program Manager, Robert McGelly.
And good evening. It's a real honor to be here. It's an honor to be a Canadian serving and representing Canada in the Upper Midwest. But first, to all veterans here, thank you for your service. And to all servicemen and servicewomen, thank you for what you do. On this day, commemorating the 75th anniversary of the D-Day, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk about one of the most extraordinary relationships in the world, one between Canada and the United States. America has no better friend or ally than Canada. We have one of the longest, most peaceful, and mutually beneficial relationships of any two countries in history. Our great friendship is based on many things. We share similar values, and we have fought side by side, time and again, to defend them. We have been brothers and sisters in arms, shoulder to shoulder, as good neighbors should be. From the massive Halifax explosion of 1917, when Bostonians rushed to Canada's aid in the initial emergency response, through 2 world wars, to the Korean War, the Balkans, we have stood shoulder to shoulder through thick and thin. We joined the U.S.-led coalition in Afghanistan after the U.S. was attacked on 9/11. And today we continue to work together in the international fight against ISIS. We are allies in NATO and NORAD, such close allies that it was a Canadian general, deputy commander of NORAD, who gave the order to shut down American airspace on September 11th, 2001, to prevent further attacks on the homeland. And of course, we defeated the fascists in the Second World War side by side. Victory in Europe came at a terrible price for both our nations. You know the details, but here's what you might not know.
How truly and deeply integrated our two militaries are. Before the U.S. joined World War II after Pearl Harbor, Americans crossed the border by thousands to join the Canadian Armed Forces. By 1941, nearly 10,000 Americans were serving in the Canadian Army. At the same time, 1,200 Americans comprised about 10% of officers in the Royal Canadian Air Force. This was the same Air Force that was among the some 4,000 Allied bombers, 3,700 fighters that relentlessly struck at the shoreline defenses, inland targets, and enemy squadrons on D-Day. An Allied effort. Plans for D-Day began in August 1943 during the first Quebec Conference taking place at the historic Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City, Canada, between then Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. On June 6th itself, more than 450 members of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion jumped inland and were the first of our soldiers to engage the enemy on D-Day. A few hours later, some 14,000 Canadian troops from the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade, composed of military units from coast to coast, would begin to come ashore at Juno Beach. A few miles down the coast, at Omaha and Utah Beach, U.S. troops were landing and were supported by units of the Royal Canadian Navy. A total of 115,000 Allied troops landed on June 6th. Many American and Canadian soldiers were young and new to battle, but infantry and armored troops would be thrown into action against some of the best German forces in Normandy. Our soldiers successfully captured their shoreline positions on the beaches. Canadian efforts in the Second World War remain a point of great national pride even decades later. The brave Americans and Canadians who came ashore on D-Day and saw action at the Battle of Normandy were among the more than 1 million men and women from Canada and 16 million from the United States who served in the cause of peace and freedom during the conflict. Over the last 2 centuries, Canada and the United States have built the strongest partnership that exists between any 2 countries in the world. There is no better example of this bond than our commitment to our common defense. And today, on the 75th anniversary of D-Day, there is no better way to honor this partnership than to remember those who served and those who made the ultimate sacrifice. We remember. And we recognize the present-day connections between our armed forces and our armed services. Even here in North Dakota, at Cavalier Air Force Station, Canadian Forces officers work side by side with American service members in support of the NORAD mission to protect and defend the shared North American continent. In fact, more than 700 Canadian Armed Forces members serve at military bases and stations throughout the United States. At Juno Beach in France earlier today, Canada's Prime Minister expressed our nation's gratitude. We thank them not only for their sacrifice, but for their example, he said, for teaching us the value of service, for showing us the true meaning of honor. We thank them for leaving us a better world. They risked everything so the next generation would not know what they could never forget, so we could live in peace. Thank you.
Thank you again for attending. Also, thanks to our Canadian brothers and sisters for their contributions to freedom throughout the world. I am a combat vet myself, and I can honestly tell you, the only other guys I saw with guns in Afghanistan were Canadians. So let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. Our next speaker is the commander of the 5th Bomb Wing right here at Minot Air Force Base and has served our country around the world for over 20 years. Please welcome Colonel Bradley Cochran.
Well, good evening. I was asked to give a 1-hour-long speech. Are you ready? I would like to spend a few minutes, maybe about 20 minutes or so, talking about the importance of this day. First, thanks for the kind introduction. I appreciate that. What an incredible evening to be a part of, right? I mean, look at this museum. Absolutely fantastic. To the museum staff who put on this event, thank you. To the what an outstanding way to honor the lives and actions of those heroes who fought and those who gave their ultimate sacrifices on those beaches 75 years ago today. I'm also humbled to speak with you here tonight in this incredible museum. I was told that Don Larson and Warren Peach are the original members who incorporated this museum 33 years ago. And looking around at this event tonight, it's clear the museum is in great hands. Many of the airmen of our wing, new to the Air Force, visit this museum to see not just the airplanes, but the history of the Air Force. And they learn what it means and what their heritage is. It's safe to say that the city of Minot would not be as incredible without this special museum as part of the city. So thank you again for inviting me to be here. So tonight, we're here to commemorate the 75th anniversary of Operation Overlord, or D-Day. As most of us are familiar, D-Day was nothing short of an inconceivable plan. Operation Overlord was the code name for the land invasion of occupied France. At the start of the planning, fewer than 100 people were aware of the imminent change in direction the war would take following D-Day. Today, when people reflect on this day, many think of a way they can be connected to it, through family members, through friends, or people in our community. While we all reflect on that day in our own ways, it is important to recognize those among us who were directly part of the war and can still recall firsthand accounts of those days. We have those individuals with us today and here tonight. May I say from one airman to another and from a grateful nation, thank you for your service, thank you for your bravery, and thank you for what you've sacrificed. June 6, 1944 is a day the world will never forget. On that day, an armada of 150,000 Allied soldiers landed on 5 beaches in Normandy. It was the largest seaborne invasion in history and included a collection of American, British, Canadian, and Australian troops, with soldiers also coming from France, Czechoslovakia, Norway, and Poland. Some historians consider it the single most important day in the 20th century. The amphibious landings were supposed to be an airborne drop of 13,000 men, more than 11,000 aircraft, and 5,000 ships. The Allied troops landed across 5 Normandy beachheads, codenamed Utah, Gold, Juno, Sword, and Omaha. Upon landing, Allied soldiers encountered thousands of German soldiers dug into barracks and fortified kill boxes, which were armed with powerful 150mm machine guns ready to inflict tremendous casualties as they emerged from their landing craft. Hundreds of men died instantly. Some drowned in the sea from the weight of their backpacks. If they survived German gunfire, Allied troops encountered heavily fortified obstacles like wooden stakes, barbed wire, and metal tripods. Despite all of that, by the end of the evening, the Germans were in retreat, and the Allies had established control of the beaches. For the Germans, between 4,000 and 9,000 troops were killed. On the Allied side, the victory was tremendous, their cost was tremendous, with an estimated 10,000 Allied casualties and 4,414 confirmed dead. Shortly after D-Day, General Dwight Eisenhower toured the landing beaches with his son, a newly commissioned Second Lieutenant John Eisenhower, and looking at the concentrated mass of troops and vehicles vulnerable to attack in such a confined space, he said to his father that such a plan violated doctrine. The Allies were wide open to bombing attack. General Eisenhower replied, if I didn't have air power, I wouldn't be here. In other words, air power enabled success on D-Day. This isn't to say that sacrifice, tenacity, and extreme courage by soldiers on the ground didn't win the day. It did. General Eisenhower is simply saying that without air power, the plan never would have succeeded. With this in mind, and since we are in an air museum, I'd like to talk for a few minutes about the contributions made by the Army Air Corps in preparation for and as part of Operation Overlord. From the beginning of Operation Overlord planning, it was recognized the air component to the invasion was going to be critical. They knew and understood they had to cripple the Luftwaffe. Fortunately, they had perfect combination of warfighting planes needed to deal the devastating blow to the German Air Force. Both the P-57 and the P-51 were incredible workhorses during the war. The sleek and highly maneuverable P-51, as you see behind me, proved ideal for long-range escort missions and an equal match to the Luftwaffe fighters. Pilots who flew it praised its maneuverability and visibility during close-in dogfights with enemy fighters. The heavier P-47, also capable of short and medium-range escort, was a formidable foe during dogfights and proved ideal for interdiction missions. The P-47 was capable of carrying half the bomb load of a B-17 and inflicted a significant damage on enemy ground forces throughout the Normandy campaign. So they also had highly accurate B-17s, B-26s, and A-20 bombers. All of them capable of flying long distances, carrying an impressive number of weapons and munitions, and could take quite a punch from the enemy and still survive. Moreover, they had experienced fighter and bomber air crew. The air campaign had 3 stages: disable the Luftwaffe, cut off main supply roads, and once the invasion began, focus on battlefield interdiction and close air support. From January to June of 1944, the 5 month leading up to D-Day, the Allies effectively destroyed the German Luftwaffe capability to produce massive air power. By the end of May, the bombers had neutralized dozens of airfields and severely crippled Germany's aircraft industry. As a result, on the eve of Normandy, the Luftwaffe was reduced to less than half of its original force. In May alone, 570 German aircraft were destroyed, which equated to roughly 25% of the total German force in the span of just 30 days. Another goal to obtain air superiority involved the destruction of the enemy rail communications. Of particular interest were the rail lines leading towards the beach areas. To meet this objective, Allied air forces unleashed heavy and medium bombers to destroy the marshalling yards. Meanwhile, fighters attacking rolling stock and troop concentrations. Pilots claimed destroying 475 locomotives and hundreds of rail cars, loaded with munition supplies and troops. In turn, the attacks demoralized the German forces, which delayed the reinforcements to overland areas. During this time, the Luftwaffe lost 8,445 fighters. That equated to pilot losses of 20 to 25% each month, resulting in staggering loss in the number of experienced crews. By the time of the invasion, the Luftwaffe was barely able to generate 100 aircraft sorties in order to respond to the Allied invasion. Although the Allies gave the Germans quite a punch, they were not without their own losses. In the period leading up to the invasion, the Allies lost more than 12,000 men and 2,000 aircraft. Of those 12,000 men and 2,000 aircraft lost, bomber air crew of the 8th Air Force, which is the organization that we here at Minot Air Force Base are a part of, make up a vast majority of those lost. For their bravery, members of the 8th Air Force were awarded 17 Medals of Honor. In fact, 8th Air Force had the highest number of Medal of Honor recipients than any other numbered Air Force during the war. 10 of the 17 Medal of Honors were recognized posthumously. One of the 17 recipients included a lieutenant by the name of Edward Stanley Michael. Lieutenant Michael survived the air war over Europe and in 1947 transferred to the newly established United States Air Force. He retired in 1971 at the rank of lieutenant colonel and passed away on 10 May 1994 was buried in Utah. His Medal of Honor citation describes his bravery, but also what the many airmen in World War II went through. It says this, quote, while serving as a pilot of a B-17 aircraft on 11 April 1944, heavy bombardment mission to Germany, First Lieutenant Edward S. Michael ran into a swarm of enemy fighters. They singled out his plane and pressed their attacks recklessly, completely disregarding the Allied fighter escort and their own intense flak. His plane was riddled from nose to tail with exploding cannon shells and knocked out of formation, with a large number of fighters following it down, blasting it with cannon fire as it descended. A cannon shell exploded in the cockpit, wounding the co-pilot, wrecked the instruments, and blew out the side window. Michael received a serious and painful wound in the right thigh. Hydraulic fluid filmed over the windshield, making visibility impossible, and smoke filled the cockpit. The controls failed to respond, and 3,000 feet were lost before he succeeded in leveling off. The radio operator informed him that the whole bomb bay was in flames after 3 cannon shells exploded and ignited all the incendiaries. With a full load of incendiary bombs in the bay and a considerable gas load in the tanks, the danger of fire enveloping the plane and the trucks and the tanks exploding seemed imminent. When the emergency release lever failed, Michael gave the bailout order and 7 crew members left the plane. Seeing the bombardier firing the navigator's gun at the enemy planes, Michael ordered him to bail out too. The bombardier, however, found his parachute was rendered useless by 20-millimeter fragments. Michael, seeing the ruined parachute, realized that if he abandoned the plane, the bombardier would perish. And so he decided to make a crash landing. Completely disregarding his own painful and profusely bleeding wounds and thinking only of the safety of the remaining crewmen, he gallantly evaded the enemy using violent invasive actions. After the plane had been under sustained enemy attack for fully 45 minutes, Michael finally lost the persistent fighters in a cloud bank. Upon emerging, an accurate barrage of flak caused him to come down to a treetop level where flak towers poured and continuous rain of fire on the airplane. He continued into France, realizing that at any moment a crash landing might have to be attempted, but trying to get as far as possible to increase the escape possibilities. If a safe landing could be achieved, Michael flew the plane until he became exhausted from the loss of blood, and he lost consciousness. The co-pilot succeeded in reaching England and sighted RAF field near the coast. Michael finally regained consciousness and once again took over the controls to land the airplane. The airplane was in terrible condition with a useless undercarriage, open bomb bay doors, a failed hydraulic system and altimeter, no airspeed indicator, a jammed ball turret with the guns pointed in the down position, and inoperable flaps. Despite these apparently unsurmountable obstacles, Michael landed the plane without mishap. Close quote. What an incredible example of bravery of those that served before us. During the 5 months leading up to D-Day, the focus was on preparation of the battle space. Now the time came to focus on the invasion itself. At that time, the Army Air Force was the strongest it had ever been, with almost 2.4 million personnel and 80,000 aircraft. An extensive jump from what had been the Army Air Corps contributing to the Battle of Britain in 1940. On D-Day itself, the U.S. Army Air Forces flew 8,722 bomber, fighter, and airlift sorties and lost 71 aircraft. Specifically, bombers performed spectacularly at Utah Beach, where B-26s and A-20s destroyed most of the German heavy guns and mortars. As you know, D-Day is well known as the largest amphibious battle to this day. However, the plan also included the use of paratroopers at a magnitude that hadn't been seen before. The night prior to the coastal landing, paratroopers were airdropped into coastal France using airlift aircraft. The objective was to put troops into France beyond the beaches. The force would split the German defenses with the intention of attacking the enemy the next morning from the front with the beach landings and from the rear with the already entrenched paratroopers. Unfortunately, the night of June 5th was not one conducive to night flying. As a previous airdrop pilot, I can attest the conditions of June 5th, 1944 were extremely challenging and made the mission that much more difficult. With C-47s loaded with 18 to 20 jumpers per airplane and operating from airfields all across southern England, it must have been extremely difficult to coordinate such a massive operation and do so entirely in secrecy. From my experience with formation airdrop, I can't express how difficult this must have been. The main airlift force had roughly 6,500 paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Each flew in over 800 aircraft. Additionally, the plan called for a smaller force conducting Pathfinder missions. These paratroopers would go in first for a few minutes after midnight. Their mission was to find the specific drop zones and set up beacons and lanterns to guide the large formations to the right spot. Each drop zone correlated to a specific unit that had specific objectives, such as to engage with enemy troops or destroy roads and bridges before the Normandy landings occurred the next morning. The conditions on the actual night of the mission, however, were hampered by clouds over Normandy. Because of the rough conditions, including low clouds and the inability to circle around for another pass of the intended air drop zones, many paratroopers ended up a considerable distance from their designated areas. Some aircraft were forced to fly outside of their planned drop zones. The 82nd Airborne Troopers landed generally in the correct area, but not on their intended drop zones. These soldiers had the challenge of finding other members of the unit and determining their location, and then getting to the right places where they were supposed to be. Since they didn't land near their objectives and had different number of units around them, they had a tough time forming their own fighting force and then engaging the enemy. However, despite these challenges, they successfully took some towns, tied up the local forces, and prevented more reinforcements from going to the coast of Omaha. They never were able to engage the German coastal defense units as a cohesive fighting force, though. As far as the 101st goes, they ended up scattered all over a large 25-mile area. Because they were so widely dispersed, the German intelligence was confused and assumed they were a feint and were unrelated to the main invasion. Believing it was a feint, the Germans held back the reserves to be ready for what they thought was the real attack, thus lessening the defensive force on Utah Beach, facing the Allied landing force. Despite the rough landings, the 101st ended up fighting and killing the division commander of the Luftwaffe 91st Division, one of the two divisions in the area of Utah Beach, leaving an impressive mark on the days to follow as the Allies made their way inland to France. Due to the extraordinary efforts and difficult circumstances these soldiers were placed in, some paratroopers ended up being very well known. One of those well-known paratroopers in particular is a private by the name of Private John Steele. You may have heard this story. John Steele is well known partially because of his simple American life prior to the war. His dream was that he wanted to be a barber in his little Illinois hometown. When the letters from John and Ingrid would arrive home, they described what sounded like an easy life, playing golf and cutting hair to make some extra money on the side. However, all that changed during the early morning hours of June 6th. On that early morning, the air was filled with the sound of aircraft engines as one after another, airlift formations took off in the direction of Europe. On one of those aircraft was John Steele. As the pilot gained altitude, the closer they came to the drop zone, it was not long until they were above designated drop altitude and given the order to jump. When the paratroopers landed, they were positioned in the center of the little French town of Saint-Mary-Glisse. John Steele happened to be the member to jump with perfect positioning and landed perfectly in the midst of the city, right on top of the spire of the church. The spire where he remained injured his descent from the airplane. After several failed attempts to lower himself from the spire, he watched the 82nd and some of the 101st Airborne paratroopers fight below him in the town. Acting dead for 2 hours, he was finally cut down by the German soldiers before taken POW and held at the command post in town. John Steele managed to escape through a window and was picked up by Allied forces not too long after. Another soldier heading into battle the day before D-Day was Lieutenant Colonel Leon Robert Vance. He was participating in 8th Air Force Mission number 392 on 5 June 1944. With the mission to strike targets in the coastal areas of France, this specific mission was his second time in air combat and part of the air campaign against German coastal defenses in Germany. However, things went terribly wrong. For his bravery and courage, he was also awarded the Medal of Honor. His citation reads as thus, quote, on 5 June 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Leon Robert Vance, Jr. led the 489th Bombardment Group in an attack against defended enemy coastal positions in the vicinity of Weremarx, France. Approaching the target, his aircraft sustained repeated hits from anti-aircraft fire which seriously crippled the ship, killing the pilot, and wounded several members of the crew, including Vance, whose right foot was practically severed. Despite his injury and with 3 engines lost to the flak, He led his formation over the target and bombing it successfully. After applying a tourniquet to his leg, with the aid of the radar operator, Vance, realizing that his ship was approaching a stall altitude with one remaining engine failing, struggled to a semi-upright position beside the co-pilot and took over control of the aircraft. Cutting the power and feathering the last engine, he put the aircraft in glide sufficiently steep to maintain his airspeed. Gradually losing altitude, he reached the English coast, whereupon he ordered everyone to bail out. But when one crew member could not jump due to injuries, he decided to ditch the ship in the channel to give that man a chance for life. To aid further in the danger of ditching the ship, a 500-pound bomb remaining hung up in the bomb bay. Unable to climb into the co-pilot's seat because his foot had become lodged between the seat, he made a successful ditching while laying on the floor, using only aileron and elevators for control, and the side window of the cockpit for visual reference. In the water, the aircraft started to sink rapidly, with Vance pinned in the cockpit by the upper turret, which had collapsed in during the landing. As it was settling beneath the waves, an explosion threw Vance clear of the wreckage. After clinging to a piece of floating wreckage until he could inflate his life vest, he began searching for the other crewmen. Failing to find anyone, he began swimming and was rescued about 50 minutes later by an air sea rescue craft. By his extraordinary flying skill and gallant leadership, despite his grave injury, Vance led his formation to a successful bombing of the assigned target and returned the crew to a point where they could bail out with safety. His gallant and valorous decision to ditch the aircraft in order to give the crew member he believed to be aboard a chance for life exemplifies the highest traditions of the U.S. Armed Forces. Close quote. So the rest of the story. What happened to Lieutenant Colonel Vance? In July 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Vance was medically evacuated to the United States for further treatment. Unfortunately, the C-54 cargo aircraft carrying Vance disappeared during the flight between Iceland and Greenland, with no survivors found or remains recovered of the 17 souls on board. On 9 July in 1949, 5 years after his death, Enid Air Force Base in Oklahoma was renamed as Vance Air Force Base in his honor. Tonight I've talked about the impact the soldiers and airmen had in preparing for and executing Operation Overlord, and how that directly led to the success of the operation. This evening, we honor and remember all the soldiers and sailors and airmen for all they did for our country on that day of days. Remembering the sacrifices of people like Lieutenant Michael, Private Steele, and Lieutenant Colonel Vance for their sacrifices and allowing their memory to live on in our heritage should be at the forefront of these special occasions. It is important to remember that today and every day we are blessed with freedom, due in large part to those who served and sacrificed so much, and to some who gave the ultimate sacrifice to maintain our freedom. To all those who served, thank you. We are in your debt. Thank you.
Sorry, my notes got grabbed. Give me 1 second. And thank you again, Colonel, for your continued service to our nation and for being here today. I really appreciate it. Our next speaker is a current B-52 pilot right here at Minot Air Force Base as well. He's also served our country around the world for over 20 years. He's going to talk a little bit about what's been happening behind us with these invasion stripes. Please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Jose Castaneda.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be chosen to explain to everybody what we've been seeing back there. I'd like to echo my boss's comments to the wonderful staff that has been able to put this amazing event together for us today. Let's give them a great hand. believe I keep my speech under 10 minutes, so I will. In the late spring of 1944, as we now know, Allied air cruiser soldiers knew that the invasion of Europe was near. Although many knew that the planning had been going on for months, the exact date and placing of the invasion was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Servicemen of all Allied services and nations were edgy as rumors and deliberate deceptions ran rampant through the ranks. Many had spent months in England waiting as the necessary forces were built up. Then on June 3rd, the order came down to the transport squadrons to paint 5 stripes, 3 white and 2 black on the wings and fuselage of the aircraft to take part in the airborne assault and glider assaults in advance of the Normandy beach assaults. On the 4th of June, bomber fighter squadrons also received the invasion stripe orders. The order affected all aircraft of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, the Air Defense of Great Britain, gliders, and support aircraft such as Coastal Command Air-Sea Rescue aircraft, whose duties might entail their overflying Allied anti-aircraft defenses. The squadrons knew the time had come. Invasion stripes came about because Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force knew that the air over the Channel in France would be jammed with so many planes that normal identification with friend or foe systems, also known as IFF, would be completely overwhelmed. The Allies feared large losses to friendly fire from the understandably jumpy force. The possibility of keyed-up anti-aircraft gun crews on ships on the beach shooting down their own transports, fighters, and bombers was very real. Even air-to-air fratricide was possible in an operation of this magnitude. The Allied planes and ground troops were still expected to meet tough resistance from German fighters and bombers, despite Allied air superiority. The resource planners had to come up with a simple way to distinguish Allied aircraft from Axis aircraft. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Lee Mallory, commanding the Allied Expeditionary Force, came up with and approved this scheme on May 17, 1944. On June 1st, it tested its effectiveness. A small flight of aircraft marked with the invasion stripes overflew the Allied fleet to familiarize the crews with the markings. The orders to paint the stripes were finally issued a couple days later. The planners also foresaw the possibility of Germans discovering the plan and applying similar stripes to their aircraft. That's why they decided to withhold orders until the last minute. The order read in part: the instructions contained herein will be effective on the day of the assault and thereafter until it is deemed advisable to change. Aircraft will be given distinctive markings as shortly before the day of the assault as possible in order to protect their effectiveness in their use. For twin-engine aircraft like the C-53 behind me, the order was: upper and lower wing surfaces of the aircraft will be painted from the engine nacelles outward with 5 black and white stripes, each 24 inches wide, arranged in order from center outward: white, black, white, black, white. Fuselages will be painted with 5 parallel white and black stripes, each 24 inches wide, completely around the fuselage, with the outside edge of the rearmost stripe band 18 inches from the leading edge of the tailplane, also known as the empennage. The same markings were also applied to single-engine aircraft, but the stripes were 18 inches wide instead of 24 inches and applied 18 inches from the tailplane. The stripes on the wings were placed inboard of the roundels. Now, anyone who has served knows that an order is one thing, executing it is truly another. So the rush was on to find black and white paint, paintbrushes, mops, brooms, even rags tied to sticks to apply the paint. Additional personnel besides ERCs were needed to complete such a monumental task. Now, who knows what an ERC is? I didn't before I researched this. An ERC is a nickname given to aircraftsmen in the Royal Air Force. Aircraftsmen are the equivalent to the E1 and the E2 ranks. So to make straight lines, chalk lines were used to mark the areas to be painted. But as you can imagine, sometimes it was just done by eye. Painting often began under the wings And when the crews climbed on top and finished there before doing the more difficult fuselage. If enough men were on the plane, it was all done simultaneously. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the invasion was launched by elite Pathfinder aircraft and paratroops. Soon after, the rest of the 2,000 D-Day transport aircraft like the C-53 and C-47s arrived over France. Some were towing the 870 CG-4 and British airspeed Horsa gliders that took part in the attack. Once daylight arrived, 700 medium bombers and 2,500 fighters covered the beach assault. Nearly everyone displayed the bold black and white stripes. The hustle of the Allied maintenance crews, along with many others, were key to ensuring the job got done. In all, an estimated 6,000 aircraft had their stripes applied in only the 24 to 72 hours before D-Day. 2,000 transports, 870 gliders, 2,500 fighters, and 700 twin-engine bombers. Most of the strikes were applied on the 4th of June because the original plan was to invade on the 5th. 4-engine bombers were exempt from the order because Germans had very few 4-engine types, and the Allies were already very familiar with the 4-engine bombers. A month after D-Day, the stripes were ordered removed from the plane's upper surfaces to make them more difficult to spot on the ground at forward bases in France. And they were completely removed by the end of 1944 after achieving total air supremacy over France. I'd like to also thank Team Minot volunteers from both the local community and the base for the amazing interaction they have been giving us throughout all the speeches.
Thank you for your service, and thanks again for being here, Lieutenant Colonel. Thank you. We have right now a World War II veteran, John Benter, up here, and he would like to share a little anecdote with us, a story about the C-47, which is very Thank you, sir.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Air Museum and everybody connected with it for the grand welcome we had. Neil, my son here, we brought this one M2 tractor out here for display, and the welcome has been tremendous. Especially we've met Robin here, somewhere around here. Over there, she's the busiest gal I ever seen. And anyway, every World War II veteran has a story to tell. I've told a few of them, and I remembered another one. And when I got here today, that has to do with the C-47. And I'd like to just take a minute to tell you what I did in the service, and just take a minute or two till I tell the story about the 747. I graduated from Crosby High School, June 11, 1943. 2 days later, I volunteered for the Army. I volunteered for the Air Force. So when I get down to Fort Snelling, there was no room in the Air Force at the time, so they put you wherever they wanted to. So I ended up in the field artillery, which wasn't all that bad. But anyway, the first thing I did, they asked for volunteers one day, and they wanted volunteers for truck drivers. So naturally I signed up. Do you know what we drove? We drove a wheelbarrow in a garden at Fort Snelling. So I was pretty careful after that. Didn't do any volunteering for a while. So anyway, then we went on a troop train from Fort Snelling to California, to Camp Roberts, California. And the troop train, of course, came from Minneapolis and went right through Williston. And my folks had been divorced, and they didn't know I had joined the Army. And my mother lived at Havre, Montana. So around here, when we got past Minot, I got to know one of the conductors. I asked him if he could get off the train when we stopped at the next stop and call my mother and tell her that I had joined the Army and we're coming through on a troop train. And here, a couple, 3 hours later, we got to Havre, and they stopped the train 20 feet from where my mother was standing on the platform. So, it was over 3 years before I ever seen her again. So that was when you went into World War II, you went into the war, duration of the war in 6 months, whatever it took. So anyway, we got to California and had training in field artillery, and then we took training for amphibious landing, and then we ended up at Angel Island, and that's right by Frisco Bay, and we were there about a week. Every day we marched around the island, which is 5 miles around, got on a lot of KP, peeled a lot of potatoes, and all that. But anyway, everything you did in the military mostly was done at night. So in the middle of the night, we get on a ship, the largest ship on the West Coast at that time, the USS Monterey. It was a luxury liner. And so we got on the ship in the middle of the night, and I'm not sure how many days it took to get where we were going, because we didn't know where we were going. So about the first week out, they said, well, you're going to New Guinea. We looked at each other, New Guinea, where's that? What is it? Never heard of New Guinea. So then in the middle of all this here, it probably took about 18 days. We had a 3-day storm, and when we ate, we lined up in the morning we had 2 meals a day, and when you get done with that meal, you start standing in line for the second meal because it took that long to feed 3,000 people. So anyway, there was a 3-day storm, and I was one of the most fortunate ones that never got seasick, and that's a whole nother story in itself if you've seen 3,000 people seasick on a ship. So anyway, we got to Milne Bay, which was at the bottom of New Guinea, and they unloaded us in with Army ducks and put us at a base there. And unknowing to us, we were being replaced for casualty replacement. When someone lost their life or was disabled, they would send somebody in there to take their place. And it didn't matter what you were trained for. One of our best cannoneers was trained from Garrison, North Dakota. Bob Parker was his name. He built the Cotton Trail there. But he was a cannoneer, and he got to go back to Australia, and he was MacArthur's office boy to the end of the war. So that's how it went. They just put you where they needed you. So anyway, I always said that in the South Pacific, you had 2 enemies. One of them, of course, the major one was the Japanese. The second one was the jungle. Because the jungle, it took me at least 6 months where he could get a good night's sleep if you were in a place where he could sleep, to get over all the noise in the jungle, all the bugs and the birds and the screeching, all the animals. And in one respect, it was a good deal, because when the birds and all this noise started, you knew somebody was coming. Whether it was friendly or not, you knew somebody was moving around. So anyway, I spent all the spare time I could down at airstrips at Finch Haven, New Guinea. It was the only port on New Guinea that was big enough to bring in big ships right up to the dock and unload them with ammunition, food supplies, and all of that. So then for a while, we would help unload ships, and all this is done in the middle of the night. We would put 12 ton of 105 artillery shells. They were in a tricycle pod wood box, put 12 ton of them on a 6x6 truck, drive out in the jungle through this much mud and unload them. And the truck ahead of me 3 of them crates fell off, and they disappeared in the mud. And of course, I stopped, and the sergeant come along. He said, "What in the heck?" He said, "How come you stopped?" And I said, they used a few rough words. And I said, "Well," I said, three of them crates fell off that truck." I said, "I don't want to drive over them." He said, "Drive over them." I sat there a few minutes, and I said, "Okay." Of course, it didn't go off, or I wouldn't be here today. And then next night or two, we were unloading 500-pound bombs. And if I'd have known I was going to talk, I'd have brought some notes with me. But anyway, the 500-pound bombs, we put them out in the jungle just to get them in some place where they could pick them up when they were needed. I said, "Well, how are we going to unload them?" And the guy says, "Well," he said, "you get where you're going to put them, open the tailgate, and put your truck in reverse and get a lot of speed up and set the brakes." And there's 3 big clunks. And once again, they didn't go off, so I thought, well, I was getting educated. So anyway, after about a year and a half of that, I got sent down from the northern part of New Guinea to some other base further down, and they flew me down, and I don't remember what kind of airplane it was, but I went down there for chemical training. And on the way back, they said, "We ain't got any airplanes to give you a ride. You'll have to." We spent 2.5 days in a small landing craft getting back to our base. And if you can imagine living on a small landing craft for 2.5 days, well, that's another story too in itself. But anyway, I volunteered for another project. They asked for drivers. They were just coming. They were going to start training for 240 long toms, which was the largest military piece that the Army had, and they had new prime movers. And they asked for volunteers, and they interviewed about 30 of us. And they said, "Do you know anything about these prime movers?" I said, "Yeah, we knew about them. We had never even seen one because they were new." So they took us, and so that's what we were training with when the war ended. But getting back, then I ended up, my story about the C-47, I was sent over from Tacloban in Leyte, Philippines, to Luzon at Manila, and I got down to the little airstrip on Tacloban, and with a C-47, and it was all loaded with boxes, and they put me way up on the top, right next to where all the parachutes tied their parachutes to jump. And I was laying on my back, and got ready to go. They got the door shut, and I think all the boxes, it was full of big boxes. I think they were something to do with medical stuff. And they started the airplanes, and a weapons carrier drove up, and he drove up right up in front of the airplanes, and he said, the pilot stopped, and he said, "This load has got priority," he said. And the pilot said they went into a big argument. He said, "We're overloaded now." And the weapons carrier guy, he said, "Well, this has to go." They shut the engines off, and we helped unload that 2/3 of that load on that C-47, rearranged it all. And then I was way up on the top there, of laying my back, and I could just see the windows down on the side of the airplane. And the landing strip, or the airport strip, went out over the runway, or the ocean. And when we took off, I looked down, and all the windows got wet from the water. We were that close to the ocean. And it was only about a 2-hour ride to Manila. And we landed, and the ground crew came out, and the pilot said, "You got to put me on a new engine on the left side." He said, "It burns too much oil." And the guy says, "Oh," he said, "we haven't got an engine. We'll just give you a barrel of oil." So anyway, about a couple of months after that, the war ended, and things were getting back to normal. And on the way back on the ship, we were on a different cargo ship, and we hit another storm, and I got sick. I didn't get sick on the way over, but I did. And I told him, I said, take me back to the Philippines. I said, rather than finish this trip on this storm. Oh no, I said, you're going back to the U.S., so that's fine. But we landed in Frisco in the middle of the night, and the greatest moment of my life, when we were about 3 miles out from under the Golden Gate Bridge, I realized the war had ended. And I cried for hours, really. So then, of course, I was looking forward to a good meal that night, and they unloaded us in the middle of the night, went to a mess hall, and it was all run by young German prisoners that had been taken when the war started in South Africa, and they had been there for 4 or 5 years, living like kings, after we had come back from the South Pacific, where the Japanese treated our prisoners. I was in Manila right when 2 days after they took all the prisoners out of there, and seen how they were treated and how we treated the prisoners from Africa. So I never ate that night. I couldn't eat. So anyway, that's my story about the C-47. So there's no water around here, so the windows won't get wet anyway. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you, John. Thanks to all of you who made it out tonight. This concludes the ceremony for the evening, but feel free to stick around to watch the aircraft and our honored veterans fly in the C-53 and the P-51. As well as, I think we're going to have a demonstration by an extremely rare tank engine. Somebody's going to fire that up. There's only about 3 of them in the world, and the Air Museum happened to get one, so they're going to do that in a little bit. Also, after the planes land, we're going to reenact the technique used by air crews in World War II. As an American soldier, I like my beer cold and bubbly, and so did all the air crews. So they used to take warm casks of British beer and strap it to the bomb pylons and fly it up, cool it down, and they'd land and they'd crack it right there. So we've got the Ale from Above Club. To the folks who've already come in and are going to participate, if you do want to participate, I think they've got some stuff over here, and you can talk to one of the representatives. When they land, we'll all enjoy some beer, and made by Atypical and Barrel here in Minot. Also, there's a panel from a B-25 bomber, and there's a Rosie the Riveter poster over there. Anybody who knows who that is, or maybe has an association or a memory, feel free to head over there and you can take a picture with that. As all the men went off to fight, the women are who carried that burden and made sure that we all had the stuff to work with. So that was a big deal as well. I think are we gonna retrieve the colors right now? Or are you gonna leave them up? Excellent, thank you. Once again, thanks everybody. Thanks to our honored guests, and thank you all for your support. Thank you for